Listen well, children of the ancient dust. Come closer to the fire of remembrance, because what I'm fixin' to tell you ain't written in no schoolbook nor carved in clean stone. It's carved in the flesh of memory. It's in the bones that creak when the night grows cold. It's in the silence of them that survived the ship's belly and learned to breathe even when the world tried to steal their air. This here's the remembrance of Amelia of the Iron Mask. And when I speak that name, I ain't just talking about one woman. I'm talking about a time when iron spoke louder than words, when the law had a whip and the black face was treated like something to be covered, marked, hidden away. I'm talking about an American South where the sun burned the cotton fields and also burned the conscience of them that commanded. But before I tell you about the mask that burned and the justice that came like thunder in the night, let me pull you down deep, down to where this story truly begins, down in the belly of a slave ship crossing the dark waters, where souls chained together moaned in languages the ocean tried to silence. And to this day, the waves still carry them cries that never went quiet. Come close now, and let me tell you about the voice that rises from the bottom of time itself. In them days of deep sorrow, when the Middle Passage was still fresh as blood on the waves, there came to these shores a woman heavy with child. She'd been torn from the Gold Coast, ripped from the arms of her own mama, thrown into the suffering hold of a ship where death walked daily among the living. Lord have mercy on what them poor souls endured, packed tight as cargo, breathing the same foul air, listening to the ocean mock their prayers. But this woman, Amelia's mama, she carried something the slavers couldn't chain. She carried the old knowledge, the root wisdom, the conjure ways passed down from grandmothers who could speak to spirits and make the earth itself listen. The ship creaked and groaned like it was carrying the weight of every ancestor's curse. Folks died daily in that belly, and their bodies got thrown to the sharks like they was nothing more than spoiled meat. But them spirits didn't sink to the bottom. No, sir. They followed that ship, circling like vultures, waiting for justice that would come slow as molasses, but sure as sunrise. When that woman felt her time coming in the darkness of the hold, she pressed her hands to her swollen belly and whispered words in Yoruba that the iron chains couldn't break. She called on Yamoja, Mother of Waters, and on Oya, Keeper of the Winds. She promised them spirits that this child would remember. This child would carry the fire. The ship's crew heard screaming that night, but it wasn't just birth and pain. It was the sound of the future being born in the belly of suffering. When that baby girl slipped into the world, she came quiet as morning mist, eyes wide open, staring like she already knew the burden she'd have to carry. Old folks say that child was born with a call over her face, born with the sight, born knowing things that ain't meant to be known. The ship doctor, if you could call him that, took one look at her and shivered like death had walked over his grave. "That child's got old eyes," he muttered, but her mama just pulled her close and whispered, "You gonna remember everything, baby girl. Every chain, every cry, every drop of blood spilled on this water." The ocean carried them to Charleston Port, where the auction blocks waited like altars of human sacrifice. But even in that marketplace of misery, something was different about the woman and her child. Folks could feel it. Something powerful moving in the shadows, something that made even the hardest overseer step back and think twice. They was bought by a plantation master who thought he was buying just another field hand and her baby. But what he really bought was the beginning of his own end, 'cause that child, that quiet watching child, was gonna grow up to be Amelia, and Amelia was gonna teach him that some fires can't be put out, no matter how much iron you pile on top. Listen here, children. The voice from the ship's belly still speaks. It speaks through the wind in the cotton fields. It speaks through the tears that water the red clay. And it speaks through this story, passing from mouth to ear, generation to generation, keeping the memory alive when the world wants to forget. Now listen here, child, 'cause this part gonna hurt your heart something terrible. But it's got to be told. Amelia came into this world without a cry, and that silence followed her like a shadow for years to come. Her mama, still carrying the salt taste of the Middle Passage on her tongue, named her daughter for the winds that blow across the water, Amelia, meaning work of the Lord, though what kind of work the Lord had in mind, only time would tell. The plantation where they was sold stretched across Georgia red clay like a wound that wouldn't heal. Endless rows of cotton plants bending in the heat, surrounded by pine woods so thick you couldn't see the sky. The big house sat on a hill like a white monument to human greed, while the slave quarters, Lord have mercy, huddled in the valley like broken teeth in a skull's mouth. Amelia's mama, who the white folks called Sarah but whose true name was Aduni, worked them cotton fields from sunup to sundown. But even in the depths of her suffering, she made sure to teach her daughter the old ways. Late at night, when the overseer's horn had called the end to labor and the quarters fell quiet, she'd whisper stories in Amelia's ear. "Child," she'd say, her voice soft as Spanish moss. "Your grandmama could read the bones and speak to the ancestors. She knew which roots could heal and which could harm. She knew how to call the spirits when justice needed doing. That knowledge runs in your blood like water runs in a river." Amelia listened with them wide-open eyes, absorbing every word like thirsty ground drinks rain. Even as a small child, she had ways of knowing things. Knew when the master was coming down to the quarters for his midnight prowling. Knew when the overseer's temper was rising like storm clouds. Knew which of the field hands was fixing to try running north to freedom. The child grew up strange and quiet, watching everything, saying little. While other children played their games and sang their songs, Amelia would sit by herself, sorting through the roots and herbs her mama gathered from the swamp edges. She learned which leaves could cure fever and which could call down curses. She learned that silence was sometimes the strongest weapon a body could carry. That child got something different about her, the old conjure woman, Aunt Hagar, would say, when she saw Amelia walking through the quarters. She got the look of somebody who remembers things from before she was born. You watch. That girl gonna bring change to this place one way or another. And Lord knows, Aunt Hagar spoke true prophecy that day. 'Cause even as a child, Amelia was learning the geography of power on that plantation. She knew which white folks was dangerous and which was just weak. She knew where the dogs was kept and how they was trained. She knew the rhythms of the workday, the blind spots in the overseer's rounds, the habits of every soul who held power over her people. But most important of all, she was learning to see past the surface of things. When the master's wife would pat her on the head and call her a good little darky, Amelia saw the cruelty hiding behind them pretty words. When the overseer would smile his tobacco-stained smile, she saw the violence he was keeping in check. And when her own people bowed their heads and said, "Yes, Massa," she saw the fire they was keeping hidden in their hearts. Her mama Aduni died when Amelia was barely 12 years old, worked to death in the cotton fields like so many before her. But before she passed, she pressed a small conjure bag into Amelia's hand, filled with roots from the old country, dirt from the ship's hold, and a piece of iron chain blessed by the ancestors. "This here's your protection," she whispered with her last breath. "But more than that, it's your promise. Promise me you gonna remember, baby girl. Promise me you gonna make them pay for what they done to our people." And Amelia promised, holding that conjure bag tight against her chest while the tears she wouldn't shed in front of white folks finally came. That night she buried her mama in the slave cemetery and swore on her grave that the debt would be paid, one way or another. The plantation master thought he'd gained himself a good house servant when he moved Amelia inside to work for his family. But what he really done was brought the storm into his own home, and that storm had a name, and that name was justice waiting to be born. Listen now to what I'm telling you, 'cause this here's when the story gets its teeth. The plantation where Amelia was raised belonged to a man named Thomas Wickham, though his name ain't worth the dirt to bury it in. He was one of them masters who thought God Almighty had whispered in his ear and told him he was meant to rule over black folks like he was some kind of earthly king. Wickham's plantation, they called it Ironwood, stretched across that Georgia clay for miles in every direction. Cotton fields rolled like green seas under the burning sun, and them fields was worked by near 300 souls, every one of them worth more to Wickham than his own family. The big house rose up from a hill like a white sepulchre, all columns and pride, while down in the valley the slave quarters squatted in the mud like broken dreams. The overseer was a man called Dutch Morrison, a red-faced devil who carried his whip like other men carry walking sticks. He had cold blue eyes that could spot trouble from across a field, and hands that never tired of dealing out punishment. Under him worked the drivers, black men forced to whip their own people to keep their families safe. Lord forgive them, but sometimes survival makes monsters of us all. Amelia, now grown to 15 years old, worked in the big house as a house servant. She swept the floors where Wickham's children played with toys worth more than most folks would see in a lifetime. She served meals at a table loaded with silver and crystal while her own people ate cornbread and fatback in the quarters. And every day, every hour, she watched and listened and remembered. The house was full of secrets, like how Wickham beat his wife when the bourbon took hold of him, like how his oldest son had already got 2 slave girls pregnant, like how they planned to sell families apart come spring to pay gambling debts. Amelia heard it all, moving through them rooms quiet as smoke, invisible as shadows. But what Wickham never understood, what none of them white folks ever understood, was that a quiet servant sees everything. Amelia knew which floorboards creaked and which ones stayed silent. She knew where the keys was kept and when the doors stayed unlocked. She knew the master's routines like she knew her own heartbeat. When he drank himself stupid, when he prowled the quarters looking for young women to abuse, when he was most dangerous, and when he was most vulnerable. The other house servants, old Moses the butler, Clara the cook, young Mary who worked the nursery, they all knew Amelia was different. They could see it in the way she carried herself, like she was holding something back, waiting for the right time to let it loose. "That girl got storm clouds in her eyes," Clara would whisper when she thought nobody was listening. "She gonna bring lightning to this house one day, mark my words." And storm clouds was exactly right, 'cause Amelia was learning things that would serve her later. She was learning about the locked cabinet where Wickham kept his special whiskey and his important papers. She was learning about the cellar where he stored things he didn't want his wife to know about. Most important of all, she was learning about the little room off the kitchen where he kept his collection of punishment devices, whips, chains, brands, and yes, that iron mask he'd had specially made by the blacksmith. The mask was Wickham's pride and joy, his special punishment for slaves who he thought was getting above themselves. He'd had it crafted to fit tight over a person's face, with just enough space to breathe but not enough to speak. When the metal heated up in the Georgia sun, it became an instrument of torture that broke spirits faster than any whip. But Amelia wasn't just learning about white folks' cruelties. She was also learning from the old knowledge her mama had passed down. Late at night, she'd slip out to the edges of the plantation where the cypress swamps began, gathering roots and herbs by moonlight. She learned which plants could heal and which could harm, which could bring sleep and which could bring truth. Old Aunt Hagar, the plantation's conjure woman, took Amelia under her wing, teaching her the deeper mysteries. "Child," she'd say, her eyes milky with cataracts but still seeing more than most, "the spirit's been waiting for you. They got work for you to do, but first you got to understand. Power ain't about might. Power is about knowing when to bend and when to break, when to speak and when to stay silent, when to strike and when to wait." And Amelia waited, patient as a snake in tall grass, watching and learning and preparing. She knew her time would come. She could feel it in the conjure bag her mama had left her, could hear it in the whispers of the ancestors when the night wind blew through the quarters. The only question was when Thomas Wickham would finally push too far, and what form his punishment would take when he did. 'Cause in the cosmic balance of things, every action calls for a reaction, and some debts can only be paid in kind. The reckoning was coming to Ironwood Plantation, sure as sunrise follows the darkest night. Now pay attention close, children, 'cause this here's where the devil started showing his true face. Amelia had been working in that big house for nigh on 2 years, moving through them fancy rooms like a ghost in calico, seeing everything but saying nothing. She'd grown into a young woman with hands steady as stone and eyes that missed nothing. Not the way Wickham counted his money twice before locking it away. Not the way his wife hid bruises under powder and paint. Not the way the whole house held its breath when his temper started rising. The girl had learned to see without being seen, learned to walk so quiet her footsteps wouldn't wake a sleeping baby. In the morning, she'd slip into the master's study to dust his books and papers, listening to him mutter over his ledgers about debts and crops and which of his property might fetch the best price come auction time. In the evening, she'd serve his supper while he complained to his wife about uppity slaves who thought they was better than their station. But Lord have mercy, Amelia was learning more than just the master's habits. She was learning about power, how it moved through that house like smoke, settling heavy on some folks and leaving others gasping for air. She saw how Wickham's word was law, how his moods could change the weather for everyone under his roof. She saw how even the white overseer bowed and scraped when the master's voice got that particular edge to it. And she was learning about fear too. Fear lived in every corner of that plantation. In the way the field hands kept their eyes down when white folks passed. In the way mothers held their children close when the paddy rollers rode by. In the way even the house servants jumped when a floorboard creaked unexpected-like in the night. Fear was the master's favorite tool, sharper than any whip, more binding than any chain. But if there's one thing Amelia had learned from her mama's teachings and from old Aunt Hagar's conjure wisdom, it was this. Fear only has power over you if you feed it. And Amelia, she was feeding something else entirely. She was feeding her memory, feeding her knowledge, feeding the slow-burning fire that the ancestors had placed in her chest the night she was born. The girl had taken to slipping out after midnight, when the whole plantation lay quiet under the Georgia stars. She'd make her way to the edge of the cypress swamp where the old spirits dwelled, carrying offerings of cornbread and molasses, whispering prayers in the half-remembered words her mama had taught her. The night creatures knew her by then. The owls that called from the moss-draped trees, the gators that slid silent through the dark water, even the panther that folks said haunted the deepest parts of the swamp. Aunt Hagar met her there sometimes, appearing out of the mist like she was made of moonlight and memory. The old woman had been teaching Amelia the deeper mysteries, how to read the patterns in spilled chicken bones, how to mix a conjure that would make a man tell truth whether he wanted to or not, how to call on the ancestors when justice needed doing. "Child," the old conjure woman would say, her milky eyes seeming to see straight through to Amelia's soul. "The spirit's been whispering about you. They say your time is coming fast now. They say the iron that binds our people gonna taste freedom before this year is through. But they also say the price gonna be higher than you think you ready to pay." And Amelia would nod, understanding more than the old woman knew. She could feel it too, something building like a storm on the horizon, something that made the very air crackle with possibilities. She'd started having dreams that felt more real than waking, dreams of her mama reaching out from the other side, dreams of ancestors she'd never met standing in circles of fire, all of them pointing toward a future she couldn't quite see but knew was coming fast. In the big house, Wickham had been getting more and more agitated as the summer wore on. His gambling debts was piling up like storm clouds, and he'd taken to drinking earlier in the day, starting with his morning coffee and not stopping till he passed out in his chair after supper. His temper, always quick to flash, had turned downright dangerous. Just last week, he'd had Dutch Morrison flog a field hand near to death for looking at him the wrong way. Amelia watched it all, quiet as a cat stalking mice, and she knew the signs. Wickham was looking for someone to blame, someone to take out his frustrations on, and she could feel, with the certainty that comes from the blood and the bone, that his attention was starting to turn her way. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late July, when the heat was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and even the flies seemed too tired to buzz proper. Amelia was dusting the parlor when she heard voices raised in the master's study. Wickham arguing with some man about money owed and payments overdue. She kept on with her work, ears straining to catch every word, when she heard her own name mentioned. "That house gal of yours," the stranger was saying, "the one with the strange eyes. Heard tell she's got some of that conjure nonsense in her. Might be worth something to a man who appreciates that sort of entertainment." And that's when Amelia knew. That's when the storm clouds finally burst open, and the thunder started rolling across the red clay fields of Ironwood Plantation. Her time of hiding and waiting was about to end, whether she was ready or not. Lord have mercy, children, because what I'm about to tell you gonna make your blood run cold. The day that everything changed started like any other, with the rooster crowing at first light, and the field hands shuffling out to the cotton rows, while the morning mist still clung to the ground like spirits reluctant to leave. But there was something different in the air that day, something that made the dogs restless and the horses stamp their hooves nervous-like in their stalls. Amelia felt it too, that electric feeling you get right before lightning strikes. She went about her morning duties in the big house, sweeping the floors, dusting the furniture, serving breakfast to the Wickham family. But her heart was beating fast as a hummingbird's wings, and the conjure bag her mama had left her felt hot against her chest where she kept it hidden under her dress. The trouble started when young Master Robert, Wickham's oldest son, came stumbling in from a night of drinking and gambling in town. He was 19 years old and mean as a stepped-on snake, with his daddy's quick temper and twice his cruelty. He'd already got 2 slave girls pregnant and sold the babies before they could walk, treating human life like it was nothing more than livestock to be bred and traded. Amelia was cleaning the front parlor when Robert came crashing through the door, his clothes wrinkled and stinking of whiskey and worse things. He saw her there with her dust rag and broom, and something ugly flickered across his face, the look a cat gets when it corners a mouse. "Well, well," he said, his words slurring together like oil on water. "If it isn't our little conjure girl. Heard some interesting stories about you in town last night. Folks saying you got some of that African devil magic running through your veins." Amelia kept her eyes down and her mouth shut, the way she'd been taught since childhood. But inside she could feel something stirring, something that had been sleeping deep in her bones for 17 years, waiting for just this moment to wake up and show its teeth. Robert moved closer, close enough that she could smell the stale liquor on his breath and see the cruel anticipation in his bloodshot eyes. "My daddy's been too soft on you house slaves," he said, reaching out to grab her chin and force her to look at him. "Thinks treating you nice will make you more obedient. But I know better. I know what your kind really needs." That's when Amelia made her mistake. If you could call it a mistake when a body's pushed past the point of endurance. She pulled her face away from his grabbing hand and looked him straight in the eyes, not with the downcast gaze of a submissive slave, but with the steady, measuring look of someone who saw right through him to the coward underneath. For just a moment, Robert stepped back, something in her expression making him remember that he wasn't dealing with broken livestock, but with a human being who had her own thoughts and feelings, and a will of her own. But then his pride kicked in, and the anger that followed was like a wildfire consuming everything in its path. "You dare look at me like that?" he snarled, raising his hand to strike her. "You forget what you are, girl. You're nothing but property. You're less than the dirt under my boots." But Amelia didn't flinch, didn't cower, didn't beg for mercy the way he expected. Instead, she stood there straight and proud, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady as bedrock. "I know exactly what I am," she said. "Question is, do you know what you are?" That did it. Robert's face went red as fresh blood, and he started hollering for his daddy, screaming about uppity slaves who needed to be taught their place. Within minutes, Thomas Wickham came rushing in from his study, followed by Dutch Morrison the overseer, both of them looking like they was ready for war. "What's all this commotion?" Wickham demanded. But one look at his son's face and Amelia's calm expression told him everything he needed to know. His eyes narrowed to slits, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold as winter rain. "So, our quiet little house servant thinks she's better than her betters, does she?" "Daddy," Robert said, still breathing hard from his anger. "She looked at me like she thought she was my equal, and she talked back, bold as brass. This is what comes of treating them too gentle." Wickham studied Amelia for a long moment, taking in her straight posture and unrepentant expression. He was a man who prided himself on reading people, on knowing how far he could push before something broke. What he saw in Amelia's face that morning made something cold and calculating slide across his own features. "Well now," he said slowly, "seems like our girl here has forgotten her place, forgotten who she belongs to and what happens to slaves who get ideas above their station." He turned to Morrison. "Dutch, I think it's time we reminded her, and I think we need to make an example that the whole plantation can see and remember." Morrison nodded, understanding exactly what his master was asking for. "The Iron Mask?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Iron Mask," Wickham confirmed. "Heat it up good and proper. Let her wear it for, let's say 30 days. That should be enough time to cool down her uppity spirit. And remind everyone else what happens when property starts thinking it's people." And that's how it began, children. Not with violence or cruelty for its own sake, but with the cold, calculated decision of men who couldn't stand the idea that a slave girl might look them in the eye and see them for what they truly were. The Iron Mask wasn't just punishment. It was a message, a warning, a way of saying that some lines could never be crossed without paying a terrible price. But what Wickham didn't understand, what none of them could have known, was that some fires only burn hotter when you try to smother them with iron. Gather close now, children, 'cause this is the part of the story that's going to test your hearts. What I'm about to tell you ain't easy to hear, but it's gotta be told, 'cause forgetting is the same as letting them win all over again. The Iron Mask that Wickham kept in his special room wasn't just any piece of metal. It was a creation born from pure meanness and designed to break the human spirit. The blacksmith who'd made it was a free black man named Josiah, and Lord forgive him, but he'd hammered out that devil's tool to keep his own family safe. Wickham had threatened to sell Josiah's wife and children south if he didn't craft something special, something that would make punishments more memorable. So Josiah had bent the iron with tears streaming down his face, knowing he was forging chains for his own people, but not seeing any other way to protect those he loved most. The mask was a work of cruel artistry. Heavy iron molded to fit tight over a person's entire head, with small slots for the eyes and nose, but barely a slit for the mouth. The metal was thick enough to muffle any sound louder than a whisper, turning the wearer into a living ghost. But the truly diabolical part was how the iron absorbed heat from the sun, turning the mask into an oven that would slowly cook the flesh of whoever wore it. Dutch Morrison brought it out that morning while the entire plantation watched. House servants and field hands alike had been called in from their work to witness what happened to slaves who forgot their place. They stood in a circle around the whipping post, their faces carved from stone, their hearts breaking but their expressions carefully blank. In slavery times, watching was another form of punishment. You had to see what could happen to you, had to carry that fear in your chest like a second heartbeat. Amelia stood straight and tall as they brought the mask toward her, though inside she could feel something wild and desperate clawing at her ribs, begging her to run, to fight, to do anything but submit to this final humiliation. But she'd learned from her mama and from old Aunt Hagar that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was endure. Sometimes surviving was its own form of victory. "Look at her," Wickham said to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying across the morning air like a preacher delivering sermon. "Look at this ungrateful creature who forgot that everything she is, everything she has, comes from the generosity of white Christian folk. See how she stands there, still thinking she's got the right to dignity." The master walked slow circles around Amelia as he spoke, like a vulture sizing up carrion. "This is what happens when we're too kind to our property. When we forget that these creatures need firm guidance to keep them in their proper place. 30 days she'll wear this mask. 30 days to remember what she is and who she belongs to." Morrison stepped forward with the iron mask, its surface already warm from the morning sun. The other slaves watched in horrible fascination as he lifted it toward Amelia's face. Some of the children started to cry, and their mothers hushed them quick, knowing that showing too much sympathy could bring punishment down on their own heads. But just before the mask touched her skin, Amelia did something that nobody expected. She looked straight at Wickham, meeting his eyes one last time, and spoke in a voice that carried clear across the plantation yard. "Mr. Wickham," she said, her words careful and precise, "I want you to remember this moment. Remember it real good. 'Cause what you're about to do to me, sir, that's gonna come back to you threefold." The words hit Wickham like a physical blow. There was something in her tone, something ancient and knowing that made him take an involuntary step backward. For just an instant, he looked like a man who'd seen his own grave, but then his pride reasserted itself, and his face twisted with rage. "Put it on her," he snarled to Morrison. "Put it on her now, and let her prophesy from behind iron bars." The mask went over Amelia's head with a sound like a coffin closing. The metal was warm against her skin, but not yet hot enough to burn. Morrison worked the heavy latch that locked it in place, the clicking sound echoing across the silent yard like bones rattling in a grave. And just like that, Amelia's face disappeared behind iron, transformed from a living, breathing person into a walking nightmare. The weight of it was the first shock, near 15 pounds of metal pressing down on her head and shoulders, making every movement an effort. The second shock was the way it muffled sound. She could hear her own breathing, loud and harsh in the confined space, but everything else seemed to come from underwater. The third shock was the smell, hot iron, and the lingering fear sweat of whoever had worn it before her. But worst of all was the way it changed how people looked at her. In the space of a few seconds, she'd gone from being Amelia, a person with thoughts and feelings and dreams, to being just another object lesson, a walking reminder of white power and black subjugation. The other slaves couldn't bear to meet her eyes anymore, those small slots in the iron that were all that remained of her humanity. Wickham surveyed his handiwork with satisfaction. "There," he said. "Now she looks like what she is, a creature that needs to be muzzled for its own good and the safety of others. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Step out of line, and this is what awaits." As the crowd began to disperse, returning reluctantly to their daily labors, Amelia stood alone by the whipping post. The morning sun was climbing higher now, and she could already feel the iron beginning to warm against her skin. 30 days, she thought. 30 days of this burning weight. 30 days of being treated like a thing instead of a person. But even as the metal grew hotter and her breathing became more labored, something was happening inside that iron cage. The fire her mama had spoken of, the power the ancestors had placed in her blood, was beginning to wake up. And when it finally roused itself from its long sleep, Thomas Wickham was going to learn what it truly meant to reap what you sow. The mask was meant to break her spirit, but instead it was forging something harder than iron, sharper than any blade. And 30 days from that morning, the whole world would see what Amelia had become in the darkness behind that iron face. Listen here, children, and steel your hearts, 'cause what I'm fixin' to tell you about the first day under that iron mask is gonna shake you to your bones. But you gotta hear it, every terrible word, 'cause this is the kind of suffering that births legends, and legends got to be told true, or they ain't worth the breath it takes to speak them. When that mask first closed over Amelia's face that July morning, the metal was warm but not yet burning. She could still breathe steady through the narrow slits, could still see the world through them iron-barred windows that had become her eyes. But Lord have mercy, within the first hour, that Georgia sun started doing its evil work, turning that mask into something straight out of the devil's own forge. The iron heated up slow at first, like a pot coming to boil. Amelia felt the warmth spreading across her forehead and cheeks, pressing against her nose and chin like fever touch. She told herself she could bear it. After all, hadn't her mama survived the Middle Passage? Hadn't her people endured centuries of chains and whips and worse? Surely she could endure 30 days of heated metal. But sweet Jesus, by midday that iron was scalding hot, drawing sweat from every pore and making the air inside that mask thick as molasses. Each breath became a struggle, each heartbeat a battle against the weight pressing down on her skull. The metal burned against her skin wherever it touched, leaving angry red marks that would later turn to blisters and scars. Wickham made sure she stayed out in the plantation yard where everyone could see her, standing by that whipping post like a scarecrow meant to frighten sense into rebellious minds. The other slaves had to walk past her to get to their work, and Lord knows it hurt them almost as much as it hurt her to see what she'd become. A walking nightmare, a breathing reminder of what happened when you forgot your place. Old Moses, the house butler, tried to bring her water that first afternoon, but Morrison stopped him with a crack of his whip. "She don't need coddling," the overseer snarled. "She needs learning. Let her stand there and think about what she done." So Amelia stood, and the iron burned and the hours crawled by like years. The mask muffled every sound she made, turning her breathing into a hollow echo, her heartbeat into distant thunder. She couldn't speak louder than a whisper without the sound bouncing back at her, couldn't cry without the tears mixing with sweat and stinging the raw places where the metal rubbed her skin. But the worst part wasn't the pain, though Lord knows that was terrible enough. The worst part was how the mask changed the way people saw her, even changed how she saw herself. Looking out through them narrow slits, she felt like she was trapped inside her own head, cut off from the world, reduced to nothing but eyes and labored breathing. By evening, when the sun finally started sinking toward the horizon, Amelia's legs were shaking from standing so long, and the iron had cooled enough that she could think something close to clear thoughts again. That's when Dutch Morrison came slouching over with his tobacco-stained grin, and his eyes full of mean satisfaction. "How you feeling now, conjure girl?" he asked, circling around her like a buzzard. "Still think you're too good for your betters? Still got that uppity look in your eye?" Amelia couldn't answer, not with words anyway. But something in the way she held herself, something in the steady way she looked at him through them iron slits, must have told him that 30 years of this wouldn't break what lived inside her heart, and that made Morrison angrier than any backtalk could have done. "We'll see," he muttered, spitting a stream of brown juice that landed near her feet. "We'll see how proud you are when that iron's been cooking your face for a week. We'll see how much conjure magic you got left when your own people can't stand to look at you." But Morrison was wrong about one thing. Her people hadn't stopped looking at her. They just had to be careful about it, stealing glances when the overseers weren't watching, finding ways to show they hadn't forgotten who she was underneath that iron prison. Clara the cook managed to slip her sips of water when nobody was looking. Young Mary from the nursery hummed work songs under her breath when she passed, melodies that reminded Amelia of her mama's voice. Even the field hands, bone-tired from their own struggles, found ways to let her know she wasn't alone. And late that night, when the plantation had settled into uneasy sleep and the only sounds were night birds calling from the cypress swamp, old Aunt Hagar came creeping out of the shadows like a spirit herself. The conjure woman moved quieter than smoke, avoiding the spots where Morrison's dogs were chained, slipping past the overseer's cabin where lamplight still flickered behind dirty windows. "Child," she whispered, pressing close enough that Amelia could hear her through the iron. "I know you can't speak back, but you listen now. This here's just the beginning of your trial, but it ain't gonna break you. The ancestors been whispering to me all day, and they say the iron that's meant to bind you is gonna be the iron that sets you free." Aunt Hagar reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small conjure bag, different from the one Amelia's mama had left her. This one was made of red cloth and smelled of graveyard dirt and powerful roots. "I can't take off that mask," the old woman said, "but I can give you strength to bear it. This here's got blessed salt and iron filings and blood from 7 generations of our people. It's gonna protect your spirit while your flesh is suffering." She pressed the conjure bag against the iron mask, whispering words in languages older than slavery, older than the ships that brought them to this cursed shore. For just a moment, Amelia felt something cool and soothing flow through the heated metal, like spring water running over burns. "Remember, child," Aunt Hagar breathed before melting back into the darkness. "Iron can heat flesh, but it can't touch soul. And your soul, baby girl, your soul belongs to powers that Wickham ain't never dreamed of." Alone again by the whipping post, Amelia let herself lean back against the rough wood and tried to find some way to rest despite the weight on her head and the burning against her skin. Tomorrow would bring fresh suffering, and the day after that, and all the days following until her sentence was complete. But tonight, she held on to Aunt Hagar's words and the memory of her people's kindness. Tonight, she began to understand that this trial wasn't just about surviving. It was about transforming. The iron that was meant to break her was instead forging her into something harder, something that could cut both ways when the time came for justice. And that time, Lord knows that time was coming faster than anyone could imagine. Now listen careful, children, because what I'm about to tell you about them 30 days is gonna try your faith in human goodness. But you got to remember, this story ain't about the cruelty, though Lord knows there was plenty of that. This story is about what happens when suffering meets an unbreakable spirit, when iron tries to bend steel and finds out which one is stronger. By the end of the first week, that mask had become part of Amelia like a second skin made of fire and weight. The iron had burned away patches of flesh on her forehead and cheeks, leaving raw wounds that wept and festered in the Georgia heat. She'd lost near 20 pounds from not being able to eat proper, could only manage water and thin gruel sipped through the narrow mouth slot when Morrison wasn't watching. But the physical pain, terrible as it was, wasn't the worst of her suffering. Worse was the way the mask changed how people treated her, how it made her invisible even when she was standing right in front of them. White folks stopped seeing her as human at all, just walked past like she was a fence post or a wagon wheel, something that belonged to the landscape but didn't deserve notice. Even some of her own people started looking through her instead of at her, and Lord forgive them, but she understood why. That iron mask turned her into a living reminder of their own helplessness, their own vulnerability. Looking at her was like looking at their own possible future, and that was a burden too heavy for hearts already carrying more than they could bear. But not everyone forgot. Clara still slipped her sips of water when the overseers weren't watching. Old Moses would hum spirituals under his breath when he passed, melodies that reminded her of Sunday services and better days. And the children. Sweet Jesus, the children still saw her as Amelia, still tugged at their mother's skirts and asked why the Iron Lady was crying. The second week brought new torments. The mask had settled into the wounds on her face, and trying to move her head in any direction sent lightning bolts of agony through her skull. Her neck muscles, strained from carrying 15 pounds of heated iron, felt like they were tearing apart fiber by fiber. Sleep became impossible. The weight made it dangerous to lie down, and sitting up meant the mask pressed against injuries that never got a chance to heal. Morrison took particular pleasure in her suffering, making sure she stayed in the full sun during the hottest parts of the day, finding excuses to make her walk back and forth across the plantation yard so everyone could see her stumbling, hear her labored breathing through the iron slits. He'd stand close sometimes, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and the cruelty in his voice. "How you like your iron crown now, conjure girl?" he'd whisper, just loud enough for her to hear. "Still think you're something special? Still got that uppity look in your eye?" And when she couldn't answer, when the mask reduced her voice to whispers he pretended not to hear, he'd laugh that cold laugh that made the other slaves shiver and look away. But something strange was happening during them endless days and sleepless nights. The pain was breaking down the barriers in Amelia's mind, opening doors that had been locked since childhood. She started having visions, not dreams, because she couldn't sleep proper, but waking visions that felt realer than the iron pressing against her face. She saw her mama, clear as daylight, standing in a circle of ancestral spirits who glowed like candle flames in the darkness. She saw great-grandmothers she'd never met, women who'd survived their own trials of iron and fire, all of them reaching out to touch the mask and pour their strength into her suffering body. She saw ships full of chained souls crossing dark waters, heard voices singing in languages the slavers thought they'd silenced forever. She saw rebellion brewing in places she'd never been, heard whispers of freedom that rode the wind from state to state like wildfire jumping from tree to tree. And strangest of all, she started seeing the future. Glimpses of what was coming, shadows of change that moved just beyond the edge of her iron-blocked vision. She saw herself free of the mask, but marked by it forever. Saw justice coming in forms that would shake the very foundations of the plantation system. By the third week, even Wickham was starting to look uncomfortable when he saw her standing by that whipping post. The mask had done its work too well. Instead of creating a broken, submissive slave, it had created something that looked more like a vengeful spirit than a living woman. Her eyes, visible through the iron slits, had taken on a quality that made even hardened overseers cross themselves when they thought nobody was looking. The other slaves had started leaving small offerings near the whipping post. flowers, smooth stones, pieces of cornbread they could barely spare. They whispered that she was becoming something more than human, something that carried the power of all their ancestors' pain and all their children's hopes. Old Aunt Hagar confirmed what everybody was beginning to suspect. "That child ain't just wearing iron," she told the women who gathered in her cabin after dark. "That iron is changing her into something this plantation ain't never seen before. Y'all watch. When that mask comes off, it's gonna be like lightning striking in broad daylight." And Amelia felt it too, that transformation happening inside the burning prison of her face. Every day of suffering was adding to some tremendous reservoir of power. Every moment of humiliation was being stored away like ammunition for a war that was coming whether the white folks knew it or not. She was learning patience that went deeper than mere endurance. She was learning to see patterns in the way power moved through the plantation, understanding how fear and cruelty created their own weaknesses, their own blind spots. Most important of all, she was learning that some forms of justice can't be rushed. They have to ripen like fruit on the vine, growing stronger and sweeter until the moment is exactly right for harvest. The fourth week brought fever dreams and visions so vivid they made the real world seem pale and distant. But through it all, one image kept returning. The iron mask heated red hot in a blacksmith's forge, waiting to crown a different head entirely. And Amelia smiled inside her iron prison, knowing that some promises, once made to the ancestors, must always be kept. Settle in close now, children, 'cause this here's where the real magic starts. Not the kind white folks like to laugh about and call superstition, but the deep old magic that runs in the blood of our people like rivers run to the sea. By the fourth week of wearing that iron mask, Amelia had moved beyond simple suffering into something else entirely, something that made even the bravest field hands whisper prayers when they saw her standing by that whipping post. The pain had become her teacher, and Lord knows it was a harsh instructor. Every breath through them narrow slits was a lesson in endurance. Every step with 15 pounds of heated metal pressing against her skull was a lesson in strength. Every moment of being treated like a thing instead of a person was a lesson in what human dignity really meant and what happened when it was stripped away. But the most important lessons came in the deep of night, when the plantation lay quiet under the Georgia stars, and Amelia stood alone with her thoughts and the voices that had started whispering in her ears. At first, she thought the whispers were just fever dreams brought on by the heat and the pain, but as the days passed, the voices grew clearer, more distinct, until she could make out individual words in languages she'd never learned, but somehow understood. They were the voices of her ancestors, not just her mama and grandmama, but women who'd been dead for centuries, women who'd survived the Middle Passage and the auction block and worse trials than iron masks. They spoke to her of power that came from suffering willingly born, of strength that grew from roots planted in pain and watered with tears. "Child," whispered a voice that might have been her great-great-grandmother, sold away from her family before Amelia's mama was even born. "You think that mask is your punishment, but it's really your preparation. Iron calls to iron, pain calls to pain, and justice calls to justice. What they mean for breaking is gonna be your making." Another voice, this one speaking in the Yoruba her mama had taught her in secret, told her about the Orisha Oya, the warrior goddess who ruled the winds and the gateway between life and death. Oya knows about iron, child. Iron is her metal, her power. That mask ain't just prison, it's consecration. You being made into something this world ain't ready for. And slowly, night by night, vision by vision, Amelia began to understand what was happening to her. The mask wasn't just punishment, it was transformation. Every day of suffering was burning away everything unnecessary, leaving behind only the essential core of who she really was. Like gold refined in fire, like steel forged on an anvil, she was being hammered into something harder and purer than she'd ever been before. The other slaves could feel it too, that change crackling in the air around her like heat lightning before a storm. They started treating her different, not with pity or fear, but with something closer to reverence. When Clara brought her water, she'd bow her head slightly, like she was approaching an altar. When old Moses passed by humming his spirituals, he'd add extra verses about deliverance and justice coming like thunder. Even the white folk started acting strange around her. Morrison, who'd taken such pleasure in tormenting her during the first weeks, now hurried past without looking directly at the mask. Wickham himself seemed to avoid the plantation yard when she was standing there, claiming he had business that kept him in his study or his fields. But young Master Robert, the one whose drunken cruelty had started this whole chain of suffering, he couldn't seem to stay away. He'd come circling around that whipping post like a moth drawn to flame, his face twisted with fascination and something that might have been fear. "Look at you," he'd mutter, just loud enough for her to hear through the iron. "Standing there like some kind of heathen idol. You think that mask makes you special? You think suffering makes you holy? You're still nothing but property, still nothing but a thing we own." But his voice had lost its earlier confidence, and Amelia could smell the fear sweat on him, even through the metal covering her nose. He could sense what the others sensed, that something was building around her, something that made the very air shimmer with possibility and threat. On the 28th night, 3 days before the mask was scheduled to come off, old Aunt Hagar came to her again. The conjure woman moved through the darkness like she was made of moonlight and shadow, carrying a cloth bundle that gave off the scent of graveyard dirt and powerful roots. "Child," she whispered, pressing close enough that her words could penetrate the iron. "Tomorrow night is the new moon, the darkest night of the month when the veil between worlds is thinnest. That's when you're gonna get your chance." Aunt Hagar unwrapped her bundle, revealing objects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. A piece of iron chain from the first slave ship to touch these shores. A stone carved with symbols old as Africa itself. A vial of water from 7 different crossroads. And most important of all, a small iron key that looked like it had been forged in the same fire that made the mask. "These here are tools," the old woman said, arranging them in a circle around the base of the whipping post. "Tools for working justice. Tools for calling down the kind of power that don't ask permission and don't take no for an answer. But the most important tool, child, is what's been growing inside you these past 4 weeks. Pain turned to purpose. Suffering turned to strength. Injustice turned to righteous fury." She pressed something else into Amelia's hand, something small and sharp that felt warm to the touch. "This here's a nail from the coffin of a conjure woman who died fighting slavery in Haiti. She passed her power to me, and I'm passing it to you. When the time comes, you'll know what to do with it." As Aunt Hagar faded back into the darkness, she left behind one final whisper. "Remember, child, iron that's been blessed by suffering becomes stronger than iron that's just been heated by fire. And justice delayed ain't justice denied. Not when it's been cooking in the heart of someone who knows the true cost of freedom." Alone again by the whipping post, Amelia felt something settle into place inside her chest, something that had been growing and building through all the days and nights of torment. The ancestors' voices grew stronger, speaking now not just in whispers, but in full-throated songs of power and vengeance and inevitable change. She could feel tomorrow's new moon pulling at her blood like the tide pulls at the ocean, could sense the cosmic machinery of justice beginning to turn. In 2 more days, the mask would come off, but by then, it would have completed its work. By then, Amelia would be something new, something dangerous, something that would teach Thomas Wickham and his kind what it truly meant to reap the bitter harvest of cruelty sown. The iron had been meant to break her, but instead it had forged her into an instrument of divine retribution. And very soon now, that instrument would sing its song of justice loud enough for the whole world to hear. Listen now, children, with all your heart and soul, 'cause this is where the tide turns, where suffering stops being just endurance and becomes something sharper, something that cuts both ways. By the beginning of the 4th week, when that iron mask had been burning Amelia's flesh for near a month, something fundamental had shifted inside her spirit. The pain wasn't breaking her anymore. It was teaching her, showing her truths about power and justice that no book could ever contain. Every morning when the sun rose over that Georgia plantation, touching the iron mask and starting its daily torment, Amelia felt something new stirring in her blood. It wasn't hope. Hope was too soft a word for what was growing inside her chest. It wasn't even anger, though Lord knows she had cause for that. What was building in her spirit was something colder and more patient than rage, something that understood the difference between vengeance and justice, between striking back and striking true. The visions had become stronger too, clearer than the waking world around her. She could see patterns now, not just the daily routines of plantation life, but deeper patterns, the way cruelty created its own weaknesses, the way oppression always carried the seeds of its own destruction. She saw how Wickham's pride made him blind to danger, how Morrison's cruelty made him careless, how their certainty that they could never be challenged made them vulnerable in ways they didn't even understand. And she was learning about iron itself, not just the weight and heat of it pressing against her face, but its deeper nature, its relationship to blood and earth, and the old magics her people had carried across the dark waters. Iron was protection, yes, but it was also transformation. It was the metal of war gods and justice spirits, the metal that could cut through lies as easily as it cut through flesh. Old Aunt Hagar had been visiting more frequently as the month drew toward its close, each time bringing new knowledge, new tools for the working that was coming. The conjure woman could sense what was building around Amelia like storm clouds gathering before lightning, and she knew that some forces, once unleashed, couldn't be controlled, only directed toward their proper targets. "Child," she whispered during one of their midnight meetings, "the ancestors been showing me visions of what's coming. I seen iron heated red hot in forge fires. I seen justice served on a platter made of the same metal that tried to break your spirit. But I also seen the price that kind of working demands, and you need to understand, some things once done can't never be undone." Amelia nodded, the movement sending fresh waves of pain through her skull, where the mask had worn sores that wouldn't heal. She understood about prices, about the cost of justice in a world that valued property over people. She'd been paying that price every day for near a month, and she was ready to collect what was owed with interest. The plantation itself seemed to sense that change was coming. The dogs were restless at night, whining and pacing in their kennels. The horses stamped nervously in their stalls, rolling their eyes white at shadows that shouldn't have been there. Even the cotton plants seemed to droop lower than usual, like they were bowing their heads before some invisible authority. Wickham noticed the change too, though he couldn't name what was different. He'd taken to drinking earlier in the day, started carrying a pistol in his belt, even when he was just walking around his own property. His wife complained that he talked in his sleep now, muttering about iron and fire and debts that needed paying. Their son Robert had developed a nervous habit of looking over his shoulder, jumping at sounds that nobody else could hear. But they still didn't understand what they were dealing with, still thought they were facing just another rebellious slave who needed more breaking. They couldn't see what everyone else on the plantation could see, that Amelia had moved beyond rebellion into something that made rebellion look like a child's tantrum. She had become judgment itself, walking among them in iron disguise, waiting for the moment when the scales would balance. Morrison made the mistake of getting too close to her on the 29th day, thinking he could intimidate her with one last show of cruelty before the mask came off. He strutted over to where she stood by the whipping post, his chest puffed out with false confidence, his whip coiled and ready in his hand. "Tomorrow this comes off," he said, reaching out to tap the mask with his finger. "But don't think that means you won, conjure girl. Don't think 30 days of wearing iron makes you special. You're still property, still something we own. And if you step out of line again, we got worse punishments than masks." That's when Amelia did something that froze Morrison's blood in his veins. She turned her head to look at him directly through those iron slits, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't the broken spirit of a punished slave. What he saw was something ancient and patient and absolutely certain of its own power. When she spoke, her voice came out as a whisper, but it carried like thunder. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her words clear despite the metal muffling them. "Tomorrow this mask comes off, that's true. But what you don't understand is that it's already done its work. Not the work you intended. the work the ancestors intended. And that work, sir, that work is justice. Morrison stumbled backward like he'd been struck, his face going pale as ash. For just a moment he saw what was really looking out at him from behind that iron. Not a broken slave, but something that had been forged in suffering and tempered by injustice until it became harder than any metal, sharper than any blade. He turned and ran, actually ran, back toward the big house, his whip forgotten in the red clay dirt. And Amelia smiled behind her mask, knowing that the fear had finally changed sides, knowing that tomorrow would bring more than just the removal of heated metal from burned flesh. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of the reckoning that had been 30 days in the making. Now gather close, children, 'cause this is the night when all debts come due, when patience stops being virtue and becomes weapon. The 30th day had dawned clear and hot, with the kind of stillness in the air that comes before the worst storms. All across Ironwood Plantation, folks could feel something building. Slaves whispered prayers and made protective signs, while white folks found excuses to stay indoors and avoid looking too long at the iron-masked figure by the whipping post. Wickham had announced that the mask would come off at sunset, making a public spectacle of it just like he'd done with the putting on. He wanted the slaves to see that 30 days of suffering hadn't broken their master's will, that property was still property no matter how long it wore iron. But what he didn't know was that he was walking straight into the trap that had been 30 days in the making. All day long, Amelia stood quiet as a statue while the final preparations were made around her. The ancestors' voices had grown silent, not from absence but from completion, like a great wheel finally clicking into its destined position. The conjure bag Aunt Hagar had given her felt warm against her chest, where she'd hidden it under her dress, and the iron nail from the Haitian conjure woman seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat in her palm. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of blood and fire, the plantation bell rang out across the fields. Time for the evening reckoning. Time for Thomas Wickham to show his assembled property what mercy looked like when it came from a master's hand. Time for Amelia to show him what justice looked like when it came from a higher authority. The slaves gathered in a circle around the whipping post, their faces carefully blank, but their hearts beating like war drums. House servants and field hands alike stood shoulder to shoulder, watching as Wickham strutted out of the big house dressed in his finest clothes, followed by Morrison and young Robert and the other white folks, who lived for these moments of displayed dominance. Wickham climbed up onto a wooden crate so everyone could see him proper, his face flushed with bourbon and self-satisfaction. In his hand he carried the key that would unlock the iron mask, the same key that had locked it in place 30 days ago, when he'd thought he was teaching a lesson about keeping slaves in their proper place. "Behold," he called out in his preacher voice, spreading his arms wide like he was blessing the multitude. "Behold what happens to those who forget their station. 30 days this ungrateful creature has worn the mark of her disobedience. 30 days she's had to contemplate the foolishness of thinking herself equal to her betters." He stepped down from his crate and walked slowly toward Amelia, savoring every moment of what he believed was his triumph. Behind him, Morrison grinned his tobacco-stained grin, while Robert shifted nervously from foot to foot, something in his gut telling him this wasn't going to end the way his father planned. "But we are merciful," Wickham continued, reaching out toward the lock that held the mask in place. "We are Christian folk who believe in forgiveness and redemption. So today, this mask comes off, and this slave returns to her duties with, I trust, a better understanding of her place in God's natural order." The key slid into the lock with a soft click that seemed to echo across the silent plantation yard. Wickham turned it slowly, dramatically, drawing out the moment for maximum effect. The heavy iron latch released with a sound like chains breaking, and the mask began to lift away from Amelia's face. What was revealed underneath made more than one person in that crowd take an involuntary step backward. 30 days of heated iron had left its mark. Burn scars traced across her forehead and cheeks. Her skin was mottled with old blisters and fresh wounds. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. But her eyes, Lord have mercy, her eyes were what made strong men shiver and look away. They weren't the eyes of a broken slave. They weren't even the eyes of a rebellious one. They were the eyes of something that had been tested by fire and found itself unbreakable, something that had drunk deep from the well of suffering and discovered it was really a wellspring of power. Wickham held the iron mask up high like a trophy, grinning at his assembled audience. "There," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Justice served and mercy granted. Let this be a lesson to all of you about the consequences of forgetting your place." But as he spoke, something was happening to the mask in his hands. The iron, which should have been cooling in the evening air, was getting warmer instead of cooler. Wickham noticed it first as just an uncomfortable heat in his palms, but within seconds it had become too hot to hold comfortably. "What the devil?" he muttered, trying to shift his grip on the metal. That's when he looked at Amelia's face and saw something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. She was smiling, not with happiness, but with the cold satisfaction of someone whose plans have finally come to fruition. "Mr. Wickham," she said, her voice hoarse from 30 days of whispered breathing but carrying clear across the yard. "You said that mask was meant to teach me about my place. Well, I learned my place sure enough. My place is to be the instrument of justice for all the suffering you've caused, all the families you've torn apart, all the pain you've inflicted for the sake of your pride and profit." The iron mask was glowing now, actually glowing with heat that had no earthly source. Wickham tried to drop it, but his hands wouldn't obey. The metal had somehow fused itself to his palms, becoming part of his flesh like it had been part of Amelia's face. What's happening?" he gasped, his face going white with terror and pain as the iron burned hotter and hotter in his trapped hands. Amelia stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, her scarred face terrible in its calm certainty. "What's happening, Mr. Wickham, is that iron calls to iron, suffering calls to suffering, and justice calls to justice. You wanted to teach me about wearing metal. Now it's time for you to learn." The mask was red hot now, glowing like it had just come from a forge, and Wickham's screams echoed across the plantation as he realized what was about to happen, what his own cruelty had finally called down upon his head. "Lord, have mercy on what I'm about to tell you, children, 'cause this is the part where justice shows its true face, where the wheel turns full circle, and them that sowed suffering finally reap what they planted." What happened next in that plantation yard wasn't just vengeance. It was the universe itself, settling accounts that had been overdue for far too long. Wickham's screams cut through the evening air like a whip cracking, but this time he was on the receiving end of the pain. The iron mask had become a living thing in his hands, too hot to hold but impossible to release, fusing itself to his palms with heat that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. His face went from white to red to a sickly gray as the realization hit him. He was trapped the same way he'd trapped so many others. "Please," he gasped, falling to his knees in the red clay dirt, his fine clothes already soaked with sweat and terror. "Please, I'll free you all. I'll give you papers. I'll do whatever you want. Just make it stop." But Amelia stood over him like an avenging angel carved from iron and fire, her scarred face terrible in its calm certainty. Around them, the assembled slaves watched in stunned silence, hardly daring to breathe as they witnessed something they'd never thought they'd live to see. A master begging for mercy from the very people he'd tormented. "Mr. Wickham," Amelia said, her voice carrying the authority of every ancestor who died in chains, "for 30 days you made me wear iron heated by the sun. Now you gonna wear iron heated by justice itself, and you gonna learn what it feels like to have your humanity stripped away one burning minute at a time." Morrison tried to step forward, his hand moving toward the pistol at his belt, but he stopped cold when every slave in that yard turned to look at him. Something in their collective gaze, no longer the downcast eyes of the oppressed but the steady stare of people who'd finally seen their enemy brought low, made him realize that the rules had changed, that the old order had crumbled in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Young Robert, meanwhile, had gone pale as death, backing away from his father's agony with his hands pressed to his mouth. He could see something moving in the shadows at the edge of the yard, shapes that looked like people but weren't quite solid, figures that seemed to be made of smoke and memory and righteous fury. "The ancestors are here," whispered old Aunt Hagar, who'd appeared at the edge of the crowd like she'd materialized from the evening air itself. All of them that died in bondage, all of them that were sold away from their children, all of them that never lived to see justice. They're here to witness what should have happened long ago. The iron mask had grown so hot now that it glowed like a small sun in Wickham's hands. But as Amelia watched his suffering, her expression began to change. The cold satisfaction of vengeance was giving way to something deeper, something that understood the difference between justice and cruelty, between righteous punishment and mere revenge. She knelt down in the dirt beside her tormentor, bringing her scarred face close to his. "Mr. Wickham," she said softly, her words for his ears alone, "I could let this burn you to death slow and terrible. Lord knows you deserve it for all the pain you've caused. But I ain't you, sir. I ain't gonna become the monster you tried to make me." With movements that seemed to cost her tremendous effort, Amelia reached out and grasped the glowing mask. The iron should have burned her hands to the bone, but instead it seemed to recognize her touch, cooling instantly at her command. The ancestors' power flowed through her fingers, and the mask released its death grip on Wickham's hands, clattering to the ground between them. Wickham collapsed forward, his palms burned and blistered, but his life intact. He looked up at Amelia with eyes that no longer held arrogance or cruelty, only the bewildered fear of a man who'd finally encountered a power greater than his own. "Why?" he whispered, cradling his burned hands against his chest. "Why didn't you let it kill me?" Amelia stood slowly, the evening breeze stirring the edges of her torn dress. Around them, the phantom figures of the ancestors began to fade back into shadow, their work complete. "Because, Mr. Wickham, death would be too easy for you. You're gonna live with what you done, gonna carry the memory of this night for the rest of your days. And every morning when you wake up, you're gonna remember that there are powers in this world you don't understand, can't control, can't buy or sell or chain." She turned to address the crowd of slaves, her voice carrying clear across the yard. "The mask is broken," she called out. "The spell of fear is broken, but that don't mean our work is done. Freedom ain't something that gets handed to you. It's something you take, something you fight for, something you build with your own hands day by day." Some of the slaves began to cheer, others fell to their knees in prayer, and still others simply stood in stunned silence, trying to understand that the world they'd known since birth had just ended forever. Morrison and the other overseers looked around nervously, realizing that their authority had evaporated along with their master's power. But Amelia wasn't finished. She picked up the cooled iron mask from the dirt and held it high above her head so everyone could see. "This here's gonna be a reminder," she announced. "Not of shame or punishment, but of what happens when people refuse to bow down, refuse to be broken, refuse to accept that cruelty is the natural order of things." She looked directly at young Robert, who was still backing away in terror. "You better learn fast, boy. Learn that treating people like property always comes with a price, and that price always comes due eventually. Your daddy paid part of it tonight, but the rest is still waiting." As the last light faded from the sky and darkness settled over Ironwood Plantation, Amelia walked away from the scene of her triumph, carrying the iron mask with her. Behind her, the assembled slaves began to disperse, some heading back to the quarters to pack their few belongings, others gathering in small groups to plan what came next. The age of slavery on Ironwood Plantation had ended, not with speeches or legislation, but with the simple demonstration that some spirits cannot be broken, no matter how much iron you pile on top of them. And the iron mask itself had become something new, not an instrument of oppression, but a symbol of the terrible price that injustice always demands, and the incredible power that lives in the hearts of those who refuse to surrender their humanity, no matter what the cost. Lord, have mercy on my soul for what I witnessed that night, children. 'Cause in all my years of drawing breath on this earth, I ain't never seen silence fall so heavy over a place as it did over Ironwood Plantation after Amelia walked away carrying that iron mask like a crown of thorns. The very air seemed to hold its breath, like the world itself was trying to understand what had just happened. What fundamental law of nature had just been turned upside down in that red clay yard? Thomas Wickham lay crumpled in the dirt where justice had left him, his burned hands pressed against his chest, his fine clothes torn and soiled, his face the color of ash. The man who'd ruled over 300 souls like he was God's own representative on earth was reduced to something smaller than the lowest field hand, something that trembled at shadows and flinched at the sound of his own breathing. Around him, the white folks who'd come to witness what they thought would be another demonstration of their power stood frozen like statues carved from fear. Morrison's hand still hovered over his pistol, but he seemed afraid to touch it, afraid that any sudden movement might call down the same terrible justice that had humbled his master. Young Robert had backed himself all the way to the porch of the big house, his eyes wide as saucers, his mouth working soundlessly like a fish drowning in air. But it was among the slaves that the real transformation was taking place. For the first time in their lives, for the first time in generations, they stood without bowing, looked without lowering their eyes, breathed without asking permission. The chains that had bound them weren't made of iron and steel, but of fear and belief. And when Amelia had broken the mask, she'd broken something much deeper and more powerful. Old Moses, the house butler who'd served the Wickham family for nigh on 40 years, was the first to speak. His voice cracked like a teenager's as he said the words that had been forbidden for so long they felt strange on his tongue. "I'm free. Sweet Jesus in heaven, I'm free." The words spread through the crowd like wildfire, jumping from tree to tree. "Free," whispered Clara the cook. "Free," sobbed Mary from the nursery, thinking of the children she'd raised who belonged to other people. "Free," shouted the field hands, their voices rising to the stars like prayers finally answered. But freedom, as Amelia had warned them, wasn't something you could just declare and walk away from. Freedom had to be taken, claimed, fought for every single day. And as the initial joy of the moment began to fade, the practical questions started pressing in like storm clouds on the horizon. Where would they go? How would they eat? What would happen when word of this night's work spread to the neighboring plantations, when the paddy rollers came riding with their dogs and their guns and their determination to put things back the way they'd always been? Some of the younger men wanted to burn the big house, to destroy everything that had been built on their suffering. Others talked about heading north, following the Underground Railroad to states where slavery was against the law. The women worried about the children, about the elderly, about how to keep families together when freedom meant stepping into a world that had never wanted them to exist. Through it all, Aunt Hagar moved among them like a mother comforting frightened children, her voice steady and sure as she spoke words of wisdom earned through decades of surviving in an impossible world. "Freedom ain't about running away," she told them, her milky eyes seeing straight into their hearts. "Freedom is about choosing who you gonna be when ain't nobody else telling you. Some of you gonna leave this place, and that's right for you. Others gonna stay and make something new out of what was broken. But all of you gonna have to decide what kind of person you want to be when the sun comes up tomorrow." Meanwhile, in the shadows at the edge of the plantation yard, other figures were stirring. Word of what had happened was already spreading through the network of whispers and signals that connected the slave quarters of every plantation in Georgia. Before the night was over, runners would carry the story to neighboring estates, to towns and cities, to every place where black folks gathered and dreamed of better days. The story would change in the telling, as stories do. Some would say Amelia called down lightning from the sky. Others would claim she turned herself into pure fire and burned the iron mask with the heat of her rage. Still others would whisper that she'd made a pact with spirits older than America itself, trading her own soul for the power to break the chains that bound her people. But the heart of the story would remain the same. A slave girl had stood up to her master, had endured 30 days of torture without breaking, had turned the instrument of her punishment into the instrument of his downfall, and in doing so, she'd proven that no power on earth, no matter how cruel or complete, could ultimately destroy the human spirit. As the hours passed and midnight approached, the plantation began to empty. Some of the slaves did indeed pack their few belongings and slip away into the darkness, heading north toward uncertain freedom. Others gathered their families and prepared to stay, determined to build something new on the ruins of the old system. The white folks, meanwhile, had their own reckoning to face. Wickham was carried into the big house by his son and the remaining overseers, his burned hands wrapped in torn sheets, his mind struggling to process what had happened to the world he'd known. His wife took one look at his condition and began packing immediately, understanding without being told that their time at Ironwood Plantation was over. Morrison and the other overseers faced their own choice: stay and try to maintain order with whips and guns against people who no longer feared them, or cut their losses and find employment elsewhere. Most chose the latter, saddling their horses and riding out into the night like the cowards they'd always been underneath their bluster. But in all the chaos and change, one figure remained constant: Amelia herself, who'd walked to the edge of the cypress swamp and stood there holding the iron mask, looking out into the dark water where Spanish moss hung like ghosts from the ancient trees. She could feel the ancestors gathering around her, their voices no longer whispers, but a full-throated chorus of celebration and warning. They'd helped her work justice, but they also knew that justice was just the beginning. What came next would be harder in some ways. The slow, difficult work of building freedom from the ground up, of proving that people who'd been treated like property could govern themselves, could create communities based on something other than fear and violence. "You done good, child," came the voice of her mama, clear as morning bells in her ear. "You done what needed doing, but the real work, baby girl, the real work is just starting." Amelia nodded, understanding. She looked down at the iron mask in her hands, its surface cool now but still carrying the memory of heat, still radiating the power that had transformed suffering into justice. She knew she couldn't keep it. The mask belonged to history now, not to any one person. With a prayer in her heart and her ancestors' names on her lips, she waded into the dark water of the swamp. The cypress trees leaned down like old men sharing secrets, and the night birds called out warnings to spirits that moved between the worlds. When she reached the deepest part, where the water was black as midnight and twice as mysterious, she raised the iron mask above her head one final time. "This here's for all of them that died in chains," she called out to the darkness. "For all of them that were sold away from their families, for all of them that never lived to see this night. Let this mask sink down to where the old spirits dwell, and let it remind them that justice, even when it comes late, even when it comes hard, always comes true in the end." She let the mask slip from her hands and watched it disappear beneath the dark water with barely a ripple. For a moment she thought she saw lights dancing beneath the surface, spirits maybe, or just moonlight playing tricks with her eyes. Then the water was still again, keeping its secrets like it had always done. When Amelia waded back to shore, she was no longer the same person who'd been locked in an iron mask 30 days before. She was something new, something that had never existed in the world before. A free black woman in the antebellum South, walking away from slavery and into an uncertain but self-determined future. Behind her, Ironwood Plantation continued its transformation from symbol of oppression to something else entirely. What it would become, only time would tell. But the iron mask was gone, sunk deep where it could never again be used to break human spirits, and that was enough for now. Come close now, children, and listen to what happened in the days and weeks that followed, 'cause this part of the story is just as important as the iron mask and the burning justice that preceded it. What folks don't always understand about freedom is that breaking the chains is just the first step. After that comes the harder work of learning how to walk without them, how to build a life when everything you thought you knew has crumbled to dust. In the immediate aftermath of that night when justice came calling at Ironwood Plantation, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would rise from the ashes of the old order. Word of what had happened spread through the slave quarters of Georgia like wildfire in dry grass, carried by field hands and house servants, by preachers and conjure women, by anyone who understood that something fundamental had shifted in the balance between oppression and resistance. Some of the stories that spread were true: how Amelia had endured 30 days under heated iron without breaking, how she'd turned the instrument of her torture into the instrument of her master's judgment. Others grew in the telling until they became something closer to legend, tales of a woman who could command lightning, who could make iron bend to her will, who could call down the ancestors themselves to fight by her side. But whether the stories were true or legend, they all carried the same essential message. The system that had seemed unbreakable could be broken, the power that had seemed absolute could be challenged, and sometimes, just sometimes, justice could triumph over cruelty. At Ironwood itself, the transformation was both rapid and chaotic. Within a week, nearly half the slaves had packed their few belongings and disappeared into the night, some heading north toward the promise of free states, others simply vanishing into the vast network of maroon communities that existed in the swamps and forests of the Deep South. Those who remained faced the difficult task of deciding what to do with a plantation whose master had fled and whose overseer had abandoned his post. Some wanted to divide up the land among themselves, creating a community of small farmers working their own soil. Others argued for burning everything to the ground and starting fresh somewhere else. Through it all, Amelia found herself in a position she'd never expected, looked to as a leader, as someone whose judgment had been tested by fire and found to be true. People came to her with their disputes, their fears, their hopes for the future. They wanted her to tell them what to do, where to go, how to navigate this strange new world where they had choices instead of just orders. But Amelia had learned something important in those 30 days under the Iron Mask, that true power wasn't about controlling others, but about helping them find their own strength. When people asked her what they should do, she turned the question back on them. What does your heart tell you? What would make you proud to be when you look at yourself in the mirror? She did, however, make one decision that surprised everyone, including herself. When a delegation arrived from the neighboring plantations, masters and overseers come to restore order and return the runaway property to their rightful owners, Amelia chose to face them herself. The meeting took place in the yard where the Iron Mask had been removed, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Amelia stood alone in the center of the space, her face still bearing the scars of her ordeal, while a dozen white men on horseback surrounded her like a pack of wolves closing in on prey. Their leader was a man named Colonel Harrison, who owned the plantation to the east and had a reputation for particular cruelty toward slaves who tried to escape. He sat his horse like he was reviewing troops, his eyes cold and calculating as they took in the woman who'd caused so much trouble. "You're the one they call Amelia," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "The one who's been spreading rebellion and disorder among the rightful property of Christian gentlemen." Amelia looked up at him without flinching, her expression calm as still water. "I'm the one they call Amelia," she agreed, "and I suppose you're one of them that thinks people can be property." Colonel Harrison's face darkened at her tone, not subservient, not fearful, but speaking to him as if he were just another human being rather than her natural superior. "I'm here to collect what belongs to me and my neighbors," he said. "Several of our slaves are hiding somewhere on this property, and I mean to have them back." "Nobody's hiding," Amelia replied. "They're just free folks now, deciding for themselves where they want to live and what they want to do with their lives." The colonel's hand moved to the pistol at his side. "Slavery is the law of the land, girl. What happened here doesn't change that. You can't just declare people free because you managed to frighten one weak man." But Amelia smiled at that, an expression that held no warmth but plenty of certainty. "Colonel Harrison," she said, "I think you got it backwards. Law is just words on paper until people decide to live by them. And the people here, they've decided to live by different laws now. The laws that say a person belongs to themselves, that families shouldn't be torn apart for profit, that human beings can't be bought and sold like cattle." She gestured toward the other freed slaves who'd emerged from the quarters and fields to stand behind her. Not many, maybe 40 or 50 souls, but standing proud and unafraid despite the armed men surrounding them. "You see these folks, Colonel? You look at their faces and tell me, do they look like property to you? Do they look like people who can be owned?" Colonel Harrison looked, and what he saw made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite name. These weren't the broken, submissive slaves he was used to dealing with. These were people who stood with their backs straight and their eyes clear, people who'd tasted freedom and found it suited them just fine. "It doesn't matter how they look," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "The law is the law." "And justice is justice," Amelia replied. "Which one you think is stronger in the end?" The standoff lasted for nearly an hour, with the white men trying to intimidate the freed slaves into submission and the freed slaves refusing to be intimidated. In the end, it was Colonel Harrison himself who blinked first, perhaps sensing that these people would fight rather than return to bondage, perhaps understanding that killing them would create more problems than it would solve. "This isn't over," he warned as he wheeled his horse around to leave. "The state of Georgia won't stand for this kind of lawlessness. There'll be consequences." "There's always consequences, Colonel," Amelia called after him. "Question is whether you're ready to face the ones that come from trying to keep people in chains when they've already decided to be free." As the mounted men rode away, the freed slaves cheered and embraced, understanding that they'd won something important. Not just their individual freedom, but the right to defend that freedom against those who would take it away. But Amelia didn't join in the celebration. She was thinking about the Colonel's warning, about the consequences that were surely coming, about the fact that their little victory at Ironwood would mean nothing if they couldn't find a way to make it permanent. That night, as the others planned and dreamed and argued about the future, Amelia slipped away to the edge of the cypress swamp where she'd thrown the iron mask. She knelt by the dark water and spoke to the ancestors, asking for guidance about what came next. The answer came not in words but in understanding, that she'd played her part in this story, that she'd broken the chains that needed breaking and lit the fire that needed lighting. But fires, once lit, have to be tended by many hands. The work of building lasting freedom would fall to others, to the children who would grow up never knowing the taste of chains, to the communities that would rise from the ashes of slavery, to the long, slow work of changing hearts and minds and laws. Her work here was done. But somewhere else, other iron masks were waiting to be broken. Other spirits were waiting to be freed. And Amelia could feel the ancestors calling her toward whatever came next, toward whatever justice still needed to be served in a world that had too much suffering and too little accountability. She stood up from the water's edge and began to walk, not toward the plantation, but into the deep woods where the Underground Railroad ran its secret routes. Behind her, the freed slaves of Ironwood continued their work of building freedom from the ground up. Ahead of her, the night held promises and possibilities that even legends couldn't fully contain. Listen now, children of my heart, to the final words of this story that ain't really got no ending, 'cause some tales live on long after the telling stops, long after the voices that speak them have joined the ancestors in the great beyond. What I'm about to tell you happened in the years that followed, in the whispers that carried Amelia's name from plantation to plantation, from state to state, from generation to generation. They say, and I believe it's true, 'cause I heard it from folks who heard it from folks who were there, that Amelia never stayed in one place long after she left Ironwood. She became like a spirit herself, appearing wherever slavery pressed hardest on the human soul, wherever the iron mask of oppression needed breaking. Sometimes she'd surface as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading families to freedom through swamps and forests that seemed to bend to her will. Other times she'd appear as a conjure woman in some far-off plantation, teaching the old ways to those who'd forgotten their power. There was a story out of Mississippi about a woman with scars on her face who appeared one night when a master was fixing to separate a family at auction. They say she stood in that marketplace and spoke words in languages older than America. And before anybody knew what was happening, every chain in the place had turned red hot and fallen away, freeing near 100 souls who disappeared into the night like smoke. Down in Louisiana, they told of a scarred woman who could make iron bend with just a look, who helped slaves escape by turning their chains into keys, their shackles into wings. The conjure women of New Orleans claimed she was blessed by Papa Legba himself, that she carried the power of the crossroads in her blood and could open doors between worlds. Up in Virginia, they whispered about a woman who appeared whenever a slave was about to be whipped to death, whose presence made the overseer's arm too heavy to lift, whose voice could stop a bloodhound in its tracks and turn a paddy roller's horse around to head home without its rider knowing why. But the story I hold closest to my heart, the one that makes me believe all the others are true, happened right here in Georgia near 20 years after the night the Iron Mask fell at Ironwood. A young woman, barely more than a child, was being sold away from her family at a plantation not 50 miles from where we sit tonight. The girl fought and screamed and begged, but ain't nobody listening to the pleas of property that don't want to be sold. That's when a stranger appeared at the edge of the crowd, a woman with scars across her face that looked like they'd been burned there by heated iron, with eyes that seemed to see straight through to the soul. She walked right up to that auction block, quiet as morning mist, and when the auctioneer asked her what she wanted, she said just one word: justice. The iron shackles on that girl's wrists got so hot they glowed like stars, burning the slave trader's hands when he tried to hold on to them. The chains fell away like they was made of nothing but shadow and memory, and the girl ran free while the crowd stood frozen, not understanding what they'd witnessed, but knowing they'd seen something that would change their dreams forever. When the shock wore off and folks looked around for the scarred woman, she was gone like she'd never been there at all. But the girl was free, and her family was free, and before the sun set that day, word had spread to 3 counties about the woman who could break chains with a word and melt iron with a look. Some said it was Amelia. Others claimed it was just another conjure woman with similar power. But the folks who'd been at Ironwood that night when the Iron Mask fell, the ones who'd seen justice served on a platter made of heated metal, they knew better. They recognized the particular way freedom moved when Amelia was around, the specific flavor of justice she brought to every situation. The years passed, and the stories multiplied, and somewhere along the way the line between history and legend got blurred beyond recognition. But maybe that's as it should be, 'cause some truths are too big for mere facts to contain. Some stories too important to be limited by what actually happened. What I know for certain is this: Amelia changed something fundamental in the world, the night she turned suffering into strength, the night she transformed the Iron Mask from instrument of oppression into symbol of unbreakable spirit. Every slave who heard her story and found courage to resist, every family that stayed together because masters feared what might happen if they separated them, every chain that weakened because the people wearing it remembered that iron couldn't touch the soul. All of that was part of Amelia's legacy, part of the justice she set in motion. They say she finally passed from this world sometime in the 1870s, after slavery was officially ended, but while its children, sharecropping and Jim Crow and lynch law, were still terrorizing the South. Some claim she died in her sleep in a cabin by a river, surrounded by children and grandchildren she'd helped to freedom. Others swear she simply walked into a crossroads one midnight and kept walking until she reached the other side, where the ancestors were waiting to welcome her home. But I think they're all wrong, 'cause I don't believe Amelia ever really died. I think she just changed form, became something that couldn't be killed or captured or contained. I think she became the voice that whispers, "Resist," in the ear of the oppressed. I think she became the strength that rises in people's hearts when they decide they ain't gonna bow down no more. I think she became the justice that outlasts every earthly kingdom and every human law. When young folks today ask me if these stories are true, if there really was a woman who broke the Iron Mask with nothing but will and ancestral power, I tell them what the old ones told me. Truth ain't always about what you can prove with papers and witnesses. Sometimes truth is about what opens your heart to possibility, what reminds you that even the strongest chains can be broken when the spirit that wears them refuses to surrender. The Iron Mask sits on the bottom of that cypress swamp to this day, they say, gathering moss and hosting fish but never rusting, never losing the power that was forged into its metal the day justice and suffering met head-on, and justice came out victorious. Sometimes when the moon is dark and the night is deep, folks claim they can see it glowing beneath the water, pulsing like a heartbeat, reminding the world that some debts can never be forgotten, some promises can never be broken. And when children ask me what happened to the plantation where it all started, I smile and tell them to look around, 'cause we're sitting on that very land tonight, children, in the place where slave quarters used to stand, where cotton fields used to stretch toward the horizon. The big house burned down years ago. Some say by accident, others claim the spirits finally had enough of what it represented. But the land itself remembers. The red clay remembers. The old oak trees remember. And as long as there are voices to tell this story, as long as there are hearts to receive it, Amelia's work ain't finished. She lives on in every person who refuses to accept that suffering is their portion, who insists on dignity when the world tries to deny it, who remembers that iron can heat flesh but can never touch the soul. So remember her name, children. Remember it when times get hard and justice seems far away. Remember the woman who wore iron for 30 days and turned it into her crown. Remember that some spirits can't be broken. Some stories can't be silenced. Some truths can't be buried, no matter how much dirt you pile on top. The iron mask has fallen, but the freedom it birthed lives on. The chains have been broken, but the strength that broke them continues to echo through the generations. And somewhere, in the place where legends go to wait for their time to come again, Amelia is listening to these words and nodding her approval, knowing that her story is safe in the keeping of those who understand that justice, even when it comes late, even when it comes hard, always comes true in the end. Who suffered, suffered. Who resisted, left memory. And memory we guard here in the legends of the lost slave quarters.